We're looking today at Chapter 5, which begins on page 282. Notice on Level 1, we're looking primarily at the VLOOKUP. V stands for vertical, H stands for horizontal. We're looking at how those work, those functions work, and how to use them to retrieve data from a table. I've got a blank sheet open here. If you click in a blank cell and click on the Insert Function button, notice under the categories there's a category called Lookup and Reference. We are using a number of functions from that category, and if you scroll down you'll see there's an HLOOKUP, and it says it looks up for a value in the top row of a table and returns the value in the same column. The VLOOKUP, which is alphabetically last, it looks for a value in the leftmost column, and this will make sense in just a minute. Then there is just a plain old lookup function, and that can go either way, but it can only be one column, and it's only provided for backward compatibility. In other words, older versions of Excel might not have the VLOOKUP or the HLOOKUP function, or they might have something written in them that's just the lookup function, so they included it here. But I have never used just the lookup function. I always use either a V or an HLOOKUP function. So let's look at how these things work. I'm going to show you a couple of things. For instance, let's make ourselves a little table. Let's call this score and this letter. So this will be a grade table. All right. Now this is a range. We're going to look up a range. We did this with a nested if statement of saying if you get at least a 90, give them an A. Otherwise check to see if they got at least an 80, give them a B. Otherwise check, etc. But we can do it this way. Let's start with a 0 and say if you get a 0 or above, you get an F. But if you get as high as a 60, you get a D. Unless you get a 70, then you get a C, etc. So here is a table of grades. I'm going to give this table a name because it's easier to do that way, but we'll show you another way to do it. I'm going to select that whole table, and I'm going to go in the name box, and I'm going to call it grade table. Can't use spaces, can't use special characters, have to start with an alphabetical character. So that's the grade table. That's where I'm going to look up stuff. I'm going to do a new sheet, and I'm going to put a bunch of grades here, just random scores. What if I wanted to look up the letter grade that goes with those scores? Again, if we can tell somebody how to do it manually, we can tell Excel how to do it automatically. Let's walk through our VLOOKUP function. By the way, this is a vertical table. We are looking in column 1 to find something, and then we're going to go across the column and pick out something from a different column that matches that row. Let's hit our Insert Function button and go to VLOOKUP. We could just type it up here if we knew what it was called, and we do know what it's called. And that's what we want. And let's walk through it. It says you have to have these first three things. Those are in bold, those are required. This fourth thing is optional. It's not in bold. The first thing we need is a lookup value. In other words, what do we want to carry over to the table and say, find this for me? Well, it's this grade right here, isn't it? That's what we want to look up in the table. So that's the value that we're going to be trying to find in the table. So I'm going to click that, and it says A1. The second thing it says is, tell me what table you want to look that up in. If I had not named it, I could go over here, and I could select that table, and notice it's going to identify it by the sheet name and the cell reference, but since I named it, I could have just typed the word grade table and it would have found it for me. It says, oh, I think you're talking about the thing that has score and letter and 0 and F. I say, yep, that's it. Now, the column index number. This is something that often is confusing. This is a number. It's the number 1 or the number 2 or the number 3. This is the column number in that table that you want to bring back to me. The first column of values is column 1. How many columns does our table have? Our table has only 2 columns. So the only numbers that could go there would be 1 or 2. 1 would be kind of worthless because it would just bring back this number. And I don't want this number, I want the letter grade. So the column that I want to bring back is column 2. And it says, based on what I'm looking at here, if you're telling me to look up a 50 in this table and you want me to give you back column 2, I'm going to give you back an F. Is that correct? Yes, it is. This last thing says, if you want to find the closest match in the first column, and if you want that, then the first column has to be in ascending order, and that's what we did, didn't we? We put 0, then 60, then 70, then 80. If that's what you want, then you can put the word true here, or you can just leave it blank. But if you want an exact match, in other words, if you want to say, I didn't find 50 over there, I'm only going to find 0, 60, 70, 80, 90. That's all I'm going to find. If you wanted an exact match, then you would have to type the word false here. And it says, if you give me the word false, I'm going to say, I don't see that in the table, in the first column. I don't see 50 over there. So, in this case, we definitely want the closest match, don't we? We're looking at a range. So we click OK, and we say, that brings an F back to me. I'm going to insert a row here, just so I can put some headings above it. This is my score on the test. This is my letter grade that I'm getting back from the table. Now, if I copy that formula down, it should give me letter grades corresponding to those scores. What if someone made 150 on the test? Or if I accidentally put 150 for their score? Well, if I copy that formula down, it says, no problem. You just wanted me to tell you if it was bigger than 90. So anything bigger than 90, or 90 or above, greater than or equal to 90, is going to be an A. So it'll handle the things that are bigger. But what if somebody didn't do the test and they had a 5-point penalty for some reason? If someone made a -5 on that test, the scale does not start till 0. And it says, you're telling me to look up somewhere on this scale, and this thing you gave me isn't even on this scale. The scale starts at 0. I have had classes where I had to do something like this because people had negative scores because of some penalties, and it would not give me that F unless I put it where it's going to be lower than the lowest score. So now that I've changed that, that should be an F on the other sheet, and it is. That is a vertical lookup, a vertical table. We don't have to have just the second column. We could have more columns. I'm going to say, what about a definition? What's the definition of F? It's failing, isn't it? D would be poor, C would be average, B would be good. I'm just making these up, but in general, something like that. And then we might even put a comment here. If someone makes an F, we might say, please study. And if they're poor, we'll say, try just a bit harder. And here we might say, okay, but you might do better. I don't know. Maybe C is the best that person can do. So you don't want to discourage them. If Forrest Gump makes a C, we say, hey, he did great. And good, we'd say, very nice. And here we might say, can't beat the highest grade. Now, what column are these definitions in if this is our table? Definitions are in column 3, aren't they? And comments are in column 4. My table does not include columns 3 and 4 right now, does it? But I can easily redefine that. So if I go to formulas, to the name manager, it says here are all the named ranges in this workbook. Here's grade table, and it covers from E1 to F6. But I want it to cover not from E1 to F6. By the way, this little thing collapses that up to a little text box so it doesn't cover your screen. I want it to refer to this. Okay, I could have typed in H6 there. And now if I go find that named range, it says that's the whole table. So if I go back to my sheet and I say, I really didn't want the grade, I wanted to know the comment. That was in column 4, wasn't it? So if I do that, it gives me back column 4 that matches that score. Let's go look at that technical definition again for the VLOOKUP function. This function looks for a value in the leftmost column of the table, the first column. If it finds a match, then it stays on the same row and goes to whichever column you specify and says, I'm going to give you that back. Let's do a VLOOKUP that is exact, that's an exact match. In an exact match, you would want things that are unique. So for instance, let's say we had students' names and their ID number, and their ID was unique. So I'm just going to use first names here. We'll say student number 1 is Stephanie, and student number 2 is Eva, and student number 3 is Ethan, and number 4 is Taylor, and number 5 is Megan, and number 6 is Joshua. All right, and I'm going to call this ID underscore name table. Now if we go back to this sheet and we say, I want to know the name of the person with these IDs. Let's say ID 3 and 6 and 9. I want to look up this ID number in this table over here that we called ID name table. We can put the VLOOKUP function there, can't we? And the lookup value we want is right here, isn't it? We want to look up the number 3, and we want to get back what? Well, first of all, what table do we want to look that up in? ID name table. And if I can spell it the same way, it'll find it and say, oh, you mean that? I say, yeah, that's what I meant. Now, the column that we want to return back to us, there's really only one logical choice, isn't there? If it's a 2-column table, you always want column 2. So we want column 2. Do we want this to be the closest thing, or do we want it to be an exact thing? And the answer is we want it to be exact, because what if we put in somebody's ID number who was not in the table? It would just pick the thing that was closest to their ID number and give us back that name. We say, no, I want it to say that ID number is not in the table. You need to look and see what's going on. So we want to say false, and it will make an exact match. Now in this case, since our ID numbers were sequential, it's not going to find something in between them if they're whole numbers. But when you only want to find one row, you have to make sure that there are no duplicates, that it's unique. Because if there were more than one ID number repeated, it's only going to find the first one and it'll never find any of the others when you look for an exact match. So we say that's exactly what we wanted. Number 3 is Ethan. Number 6 is Joshua. And number 9 says, I don't see a number 9. I didn't find it in the table. And we go look at the table. We say, oh, that's because there is no number 9. That's why you didn't find it. So we say that worked exactly how it should. We could have first name, last name, phone, city, state, zip, etc. And we could pull out any of those things that we wanted to. Now let's do one more illustration, and we'll just turn this table horizontally. I'm going to copy these cells, and I'm going to paste special, and I'm going to transpose them. In other words, rows become columns, columns become rows, and when I transpose them, it's the exact same table, only now it's 2 rows by 7 columns instead of 2 columns by 7 rows. We can do the exact same thing. We can look up things, only now we'll use the HLOOKUP function, horizontal lookup. That's the one. And guess what? This looks exactly like what we were just doing, wasn't it? Except notice it says looks for a value in the top row of the table. And once it finds it in the top row, then it goes down and finds something from the same column in a row that you specify. So it's just turned sideways. The lookup value is again going to be number 3. Our table array, we didn't name it, so let's go select it. Here's our table array. And I think we would want that to be absolute, wouldn't we? So when we copy that formula down, it stays with that table. So let's make that absolute. Now, which row do we want it to return? How many rows are in that table? Only 2 rows. And the first row, the top row, is row 1. So the only thing we could ask for is 2. And we would like that to be exact. By the way, what would happen if we said, give me back row 1? It would say, okay, I looked up number 3, I found it, and I started to go down the column, and you said, oh wait, just stay in row 1 and give me that. So it works, but it's not very helpful, is to find anything under 9 again. But all we'd have to do is change this to row 2, and now it should bring back the name for us, only it's bringing it back from that other table that's horizontal.